9:03 a.m. The ruling didn't whisper, it roared. And Washington, a city numb to outrage, flinched. The opinion wasn't leaked, it wasn't hinted. It landed, full weight, no cushion, in a courtroom already on edge. In 47 pages, a federal judge didn't just accuse the Trump administration of defying a lawful court order. He eviscerated it, not with anger, not with theatrics, but with something far more dangerous: clarity. And on page 46, in block letters bolded and underscored, came the sentence that cracked the Capitol open. This administration has confused executive discretion with executive immunity. The court finds no such immunity exists, not in law and not in this courtroom. By 9:04 a.m., news anchors were scrambling to rewrite segments. By 9:05, the phrase "fatal blow" was trending. Not because the ruling jailed anyone, not because it declared Trump guilty of a crime, but because it cut through every defense his team had built for years and left nothing standing. In a courthouse just blocks from the Capitol, a judge the public rarely knew by name, Harold M. Kessler, a Reagan-era appointee long seen as a judicial moderate, had reached his limit. And when Judge Kessler reached his limit, he didn't yell. He wrote. This wasn't a bombshell. This was a legal execution, and the subject wasn't just Donald Trump. It was presidential impunity. Inside courtroom 3B, the ceiling fans barely moved. No noise but the low hum of press cameras powering up and aides whispering into earpieces. The silence wasn't respectful. It was electrified. Everyone in the room had the same question. What just happened? And more urgently, what would Trump do now? No one had seen him yet, but they knew he was coming. The man who turned trials into rallies, subpoenas into sound bites, and constitutional questions into partisan dog whistles was about to walk into a courtroom he no longer controlled. This wasn't a campaign stage. This wasn't Twitter. This was law. And law had just punched back. 6 months earlier, it barely made the news. A man named Miguel Ramirez, once flagged by ICE, was deported to Honduras after being denied asylum. A routine case, or so it seemed. Until documents emerged, heavily redacted, buried in discovery, showing Ramirez had already been granted a stay of removal pending a final judicial review. In other words, he was deported illegally. The court order protecting him had been filed, signed, processed, but it never reached the agency that carried out the removal. Why? That's where things started to stink. Internal emails, eventually made public through litigation, showed a chain of correspondence between senior DHS officials and the White House, raising concerns not about Ramirez's threat level, but about the optics of letting him remain in the country. One email, time-stamped at 11:02 p.m., read, "POTUS will not be pleased if this one slips through. Finalize before morning." By 6 a.m., Ramirez was shackled on a plane. When Judge Kessler learned of this, he didn't call it a mistake. He called it a violation. And then he ordered the administration to reverse it. Return Ramirez. Restore his rights. Resume proceedings lawfully. The Trump administration delayed. They filed motions, claimed national security, cited foreign sovereignty, and limited jurisdiction. They even said the U.S. had done its part and could not be held responsible for a sovereign nation's prisons. But Judge Kessler saw the truth. The motion wasn't legal. It was defensive choreography, a stalling tactic wrapped in jargon. And when Trump was told about the ruling, he went on air, live, in front of 7 million viewers, and he laughed. "We're not flying some guy back because a liberal judge wants to feel righteous. That's not how I run the country." That line, the one he tossed out between applause lines, would become Exhibit A. Judge Kessler took it personally, not as an insult, but as evidence. Because for him, this wasn't about Ramirez. It was about something bigger than a man. It was about obedience to the rule of law. Judge Harold M. Kessler didn't enter law to be a warrior. He came up in the quiet era, before hearings were televised, before judges trended on social media, before politics flooded courtrooms like a tide with no intention of receding. His rulings were known for being surgical, restrained, and most of all, respectful of the limits of his role. He didn't grandstand. He didn't tweet. He didn't believe justice needed to be loud to be heard. But over the past 4 years, something had shifted. It began as a trickle. Cases stalled on executive orders, subpoenas ignored, witnesses vanishing into national security loopholes. Kessler watched as executive power stretched, bent, and then, quietly, began to snap the hinges off the doors it used to knock on. Still he waited for the system to correct itself, waited for Congress to act, waited for the Constitution to self-heal. It didn't. And when Ramirez was deported in defiance of a lawful order, and the White House smiled through the fallout like it was a press gag, Kessler understood something that haunted him more than outrage. The system wasn't broken, it was being ignored. And if a judge didn't stand up now, not for politics, not for personality, but for the idea of lawful governance itself, then he was no longer a referee. He was a bystander. So, Kessler sharpened his pen. He went into chambers and wrote like a man who had run out of excuses. He didn't call it political. He called it what it was: a deliberate, coordinated, and contemptuous refusal to uphold the lawful boundaries of executive power. Then he scheduled the hearing. No leaks, no interviews, just a time, a date, a room, Courtroom 3B. He would say what needed to be said, and he wouldn't whisper it, because Judge Harold M. Kessler had waited long enough. The hallway outside Courtroom 3B looked more like a press staging zone than a federal building. Cameras stood shoulder to shoulder. Cables snaked along the marble floor. Reporters checked mic levels like they were preparing for a war briefing. Everyone was waiting, not for a verdict, but for a spectacle. Inside, the room buzzed with a charged silence. On the left side, reporters, staffers, law clerks, a few brave members of the public who'd made it through security. On the right, government attorneys, White House legal counsel, and a single row of aides with phones silenced but ready, always ready. At the center, the seat everyone couldn't help but glance at, sat an empty table. Trump wasn't late. He was timing the entrance. The seal above the judge's bench seemed to loom larger than usual. The eagle cast in gold, wings wide, the words E pluribus unum gleaming under soft courtroom light. Then, without announcement, the side door opened. He walked in. Donald Trump, not the candidate, not the speaker, but the defendant. His suit was charcoal gray, the tie a familiar red. Not just any red, the one from every rally, every press conference, every clip that went viral. He didn't look around. He didn't need to. He owned the space with posture alone, shoulders square, chin up, arms loose, but controlled. He walked like the cameras were still rolling, like this was another campaign stop, another debate stage, another moment to reclaim the narrative. But the room didn't give him applause. It gave him walls. He sat. One row behind him, his lead attorney whispered something. Trump nodded once, that was all. Then a ripple moved through the courtroom. The door behind the bench opened, and Judge Harold M. Kessler entered. He didn't bring security. He didn't need to. What followed him wasn't a marshal. It was authority, the kind that doesn't ask for attention. It commands it by simply existing. He didn't smile. He didn't acknowledge the crowd. He looked straight ahead, placed the ruling on the bench, and adjusted his glasses with 2 fingers. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't say good morning. He simply said, "This court is now in session." And just like that, a room built for justice became a battlefield for accountability. Trump's fingers drummed softly on the table. Kessler glanced down at the folder before him, flipped to the 2nd page, and looked up. "Mr. President," he said, tone flat, "you may speak." The room didn't move, because in that moment, everyone knew. This wasn't going to be a legal argument. This was going to be a war of ideals. Trump didn't rise right away. He adjusted his cuffs, smoothed his tie, then slowly, deliberately, he stood. The courtroom didn't stir, but it shifted. The air felt denser, like it knew what was coming. Trump scanned the room, not nervously, not respectfully, but like a man surveying a crowd, not a court. He didn't look at Kessler. He looked past him, toward the press row, toward the cameras, toward history. And then he spoke. "Let's stop pretending this is about the law. No greeting, no legal language, just a challenge. We all know what this is. Another attempt to create a crisis where there is none. Another moment for the media to clutch pearls and for bureaucrats in robes to pretend they run the country." His voice was calm, but every syllable was wrapped in steel. He was on stage now, and he knew his audience, not the judge, but the millions watching, waiting, ready to echo his words. "They say I disobeyed a court order. I say I protected this nation, and I'll do it again. They say I undermined the process. I say I refuse to let that process become a revolving door for criminals who game the system while law-abiding Americans suffer." He leaned forward, one hand gripping the podium. This man, Ramirez, was flagged by Homeland Security. Not once, not twice, 5 times. He was denied, reviewed, flagged again. You want me to charter him a plane back to America because of a paperwork delay? This is what due process looks like now. A full-service return ticket for people who never should have been here in the first place. He pointed toward the gallery, not to anyone in particular, just enough to let the gesture sting. While we sit here debating the meaning of facilitate, there are kids getting murdered in cities overrun by people like Ramirez. But sure, let's obsess over commas and court filings. He turned, now facing Kessler directly. "I didn't ignore the order. I assessed the risk. I acted. I didn't break the law. I led." He paused, not for effect, but for ownership. "The judge wants to talk about limits. Let's talk about his. Because I'm not seeing a lot of accountability coming from that bench when ICE agents are bleeding, when mothers are burying their sons, when our neighborhoods are flooded with fentanyl from traffickers we almost deported." A few gasps, a shuffle of seats. But Trump pressed on. "What you call contempt, I call common sense. What you call defiance, I call duty. I'm not here to beg for understanding. I'm here to make something clear. If the court wants a president who bows to every motion, every memo, every mid-level official screaming about technicalities, then you've elected the wrong man." He let the words hang. Then, with a smirk that looked practiced but piercing, he delivered his final line. "You want me to apologize for protecting this country? Not today. Not ever." And he sat down. No applause, no boos, just the sound of a line drawn in marble. Kessler didn't speak right away. He didn't reach for his gavel. He didn't adjust his glasses. He simply looked at Trump, long enough to register everything, but short enough to deny him the power of reaction. Then, finally, softly, he began. "The court appreciates the president's remarks." It wasn't sarcasm. It was control. And now, Kessler took it back. "But let's begin with the facts." He opened the folder on his desk, slowly, deliberately. "The individual in question, Mr. Ramirez, was under active judicial review. A stay had been granted. That stay, by law, suspended deportation until due process had been fulfilled. He looked up. It was not ambiguous. It was not pending. It was in force. He turned a page. Your administration, Mr. President, not only failed to comply with that order, it actively intervened to prevent its execution. That's not discretion. That's evasion. You claim national security as a shield. But there was no emergency motion filed. No classified threat submitted to this court. Just an email chain urging speed to avoid political backlash. Kessler closed the folder. This court is not unaware of the pressures on the executive, nor is it naive to the realities of governance. But executive power, Mr. President, does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in a framework, and that framework is called the law. He leaned forward just slightly. And when the President of the United States declares on national television that a lawful order will be disregarded, that is not leadership. That is contempt. The courtroom remained still. Trump didn't move. His fingers, previously tapping, were still. This is not a debate about who loves America more. This is not a referendum on your courage or your convictions. This is a reckoning with your responsibility. He opened the folder again, lifted a sheet, and read aloud. Facilitation does not permit the erroneous deportation of an individual to a foreign prison. The order is not optional. Delay is not defense. Then he looked up again, not just at Trump, but at the room. This court does not serve popularity. It does not answer to applause, and it does not exist to flatter power. His voice sharpened, but never rose. Mr. President, you did not misunderstand the ruling. You mocked it. You tested the limits not because you believed you were right, but because you believed you could. He leaned back. The tension now redistributed, no longer burning but coiled like wire. And today this court is here to remind you, you can't. Judge Kessler paused, just long enough for the oxygen to shift. He adjusted the sheet in his hand, but didn't read from it. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the gallery, not toward Trump, not toward the cameras, but beyond them, as if he was seeing a courtroom layered with ghosts. There's a reason we keep the portraits on these walls. He motioned to the black and white faces lining the courtroom. Judges, jurists, quiet defenders of a system designed to outlast its defenders. Not because they were flawless, but because they understood something we are dangerously close to forgetting. He turned back to Trump. That the presidency is not an altar. It is an office. The words didn't slam. They settled. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in Brown v. Board of Education. It was unpopular, disruptive, even dangerous, but it was constitutional. President Eisenhower did not agree with the ruling. He worried about the unrest. He worried about the politics. He did not tweet. He did not stall. He sent the 101st Airborne to Little Rock. Kessler paused, not because he loved the court, but because he respected the country more than his discomfort. Now he fixed his gaze fully on Trump. You were not asked to endorse this ruling. You were asked to obey it. You were not required to understand it. You were required to respect it. Because respect is not something this court earns by flattery. It earns it by function. He stepped down from the bench. A rare move. One that turned posture into presence. This country has survived world wars, terror attacks, financial collapse. But what we cannot survive is the erosion of shared rules. The moment we accept that obedience to law is optional, we are no longer a republic. We are a brand. And then came the cold blade of contrast. You didn't stand behind the law, Mr. President. You stood beside it for photos. You stood above it for applause. And you stood beyond it when it no longer served your narrative. Now the courtroom wasn't breathing. It was bracing. But the law does not yield to preference, and it does not bend to posture. He turned and stepped back to the bench. It holds. And today, it will hold again. Judge Kessler opened the folder slowly, not for suspense, for precision. He held the ruling like a scalpel, not a weapon, but a tool to cut through illusion. The court finds the administration in direct violation of Federal Judicial Order 468B. It further finds that the justifications provided, national security, jurisdictional ambiguity, foreign detainment, were not supported by legal precedent, case law, or administrative necessity. He turned a page. It is the opinion of this court that the President of the United States acted not with ignorance of the law, but with indifference to it. This action and the subsequent statements made publicly by the President constitute an explicit rejection of judicial authority. Now he looked up. That rejection, Mr. President, has consequences. He read the final section. The court hereby orders the immediate repatriation of Mr. Miguel Ramirez under judicial escort. All legal privileges related to executive delay are hereby suspended for the duration of enforcement. And this court formally refers the conduct of the office of the executive to the United States Congress for review under Article 1, Section 2, Clause 5 of the Constitution. The line hit like a detonation, a referral to Congress for investigation, for censure, for impeachment. Kessler didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. This court does not suggest guilt. It suggests accountability. He lowered the folder, closed it. One soft, decisive click. No man may decide which laws apply to him. That is the privilege of a king, and we do not serve one here. He looked at Trump, square in the eyes. This is the United States of America, and here the law leads. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded with finality, with fallout, with history. Trump didn't speak. Not yet. Not now. The man who had turned silence into a tactic now wore it like armor cracked from the inside. And the judge? He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply looked forward, as if speaking not just to the room, but to the country that would watch this moment again and again, long after the echo faded. This ruling is not a punishment. It is a reminder. That law, when challenged, does not retreat. It responds. He didn't speak, not right away, not at all. Trump's fingers, once tapping, had gone still. His posture, once defiant, was intact, but tighter, less performative, more confined, like a man sitting inside his own echo. The courtroom didn't move. No gasps, no outbursts, just the sound of realization. Quiet, like wind through heavy drapes. Behind him, his attorneys shifted. Their briefcases stayed closed. They had no motions ready, no rehearsed outrage, because how do you argue with a mirror that shows everything? Judge Kessler didn't watch Trump for a reaction. He'd already said what needed to be said. He didn't bring justice crashing down like a hammer. He lowered it like a ledger finally balanced. The folder on the bench, now closed, sat like a gravestone. This court is adjourned. The words were soft, but the echo they left was devastating. Kessler stood. The robe hung loosely on his shoulders, as if his frame had shrunk under the weight of what had been spoken. But his steps didn't falter. He didn't walk like a victor. He walked like a man who had finally fulfilled an obligation long deferred. Behind him, the seal of the United States watched over the room, unmoving, untouched, but somehow reclaimed. Trump remained seated. His eyes weren't on the judge, not on the crowd, not even on the cameras. They were somewhere else, distant, fixed, maybe for the first time unfocused. No phone in hand, no podium to twist the moment into applause. Just a chair, a table, and a truth that would outlast every soundbite. He came to challenge the law. The law didn't flinch. When the news broke, the headlines exploded. Judge refers Trump for congressional review. Courtroom showdown ends in historic rebuke. Fatal blow delivered, law strikes back. Clips played on every network. Some applauded, some spun, but none ignored it. Because what happened in Courtroom 3B wasn't just about Trump. It was about the office he held, the power he tested, and the law he underestimated. It wasn't the first time a president had been challenged by the judiciary, but it was one of the few times the gavel hit harder than the microphone. Outside, the streets filled with chatter, not protests, not cheers, just people trying to understand the weight of what they'd witnessed. Inside the Department of Justice, phones rang non-stop. On the Hill, members of Congress drafted statements, checked polling numbers, whispered in closed-door meetings. What now? What happens next? Will he face charges? Will the people care? But the answer wasn't in the fallout. It was in the moment itself. Judge Kessler returned to chambers alone. No cameras, no entourage, just a man in his 70s hanging up his robe, as he had 1,000 times before. Except today, he didn't just take off the robe. He laid down a precedent, one that future judges might one day cite, one that presidents might one day fear, one that citizens might one day remember. That no matter how loud a leader becomes, the law doesn't need to shout. Across the country, a generation watched the clip. Trump, silent. The judge, steady. The ruling, firm. A confrontation not of ideology, but of limits. This isn't about one man, Kessler had said. This is about what happens when power forgets what it's for. In classrooms, teachers played the video. In courtrooms, attorneys cited the language. In homes, parents tried to explain it to their children. He's the president. He made a choice. And someone finally told him, no, because that's what the ruling was. Not revenge, not resistance. Just a word we forgot mattered. No. You don't get to erase orders. You don't get to bend the Constitution around your instincts. You don't get to choose which laws you follow. Not if we still want to be a country. And that's where the camera froze. Not on the judge, not on the drama, but on the empty chair behind the table where Trump had sat. The frame became iconic, not because of what it contained, but because of what it represented. The most powerful man in the nation, powerless before the law. That's what the fatal blow really was. Not a sound, not a sentence, a realization that law doesn't yield, not to wealth, not to charisma, not to noise, not even to a man who once believed the rules were made for everyone but him. And for the first time in a long time, America remembered that the law doesn't kneel. It stands, and it stood that day. It is so ordered.